The rain started before daylight and did not stop. By the time the gray morning came up over the Wyoming hills, the whole Blackwater ranch was wet, cold, and tense. Water ran in muddy lines across the yard. The creek behind the barn had turned into a brown, noisy river. It slammed against its banks and carried small sticks, weeds, and foam downstream, like the stream was angry. Maggie Holt stood under the lean-to by the tack shed and watched it all with her hands on her hips. She was 19, thin as a fence post, and just as stubborn. Her brown hair was tied back tight under a worn hat. Her boots were already muddy from checking the lower pasture. Behind her, 27 head of cattle shifted in the wet corral, heads low, tails twitching. They did not like the weather. Neither did Maggie. Earl Baines, the ranch foreman, came up from the barn with his left arm pressed to his side. His face was pale under his beard. "I don't like that river," he said. "Neither do I," Maggie said. He nodded toward the ford below the cottonwoods. "If the water keeps rising, we won't get the herd across today." "We have to," Maggie said. Earl let out a rough breath. "Ben Rusk knows that too." At the sound of that name, Maggie looked toward the north ridge. Through the rain, she could just make out 2 riders on dark horses. They were too far away for faces, but she knew one of them had to be Ben Rusk, or one of his men. Rusk ran the outfit on the north side of Blackwater Ford. He had been after the Holt cattle for months. Not with guns, not yet, just with talk, papers, and bad faith. Last spring, the Holts had moved the herd to the West Range for grass. Now they needed to get the cattle home before the storm water trapped them. If they waited too long, Rusk would say the herd had drifted onto his side and belonged to him. Maggie did not know if the law would back him, but she knew what happened when cattle got mixed, lost, or claimed by the wrong man. Earl turned to head for the barn, then stopped. His horse, a big black gelding, had stepped on a slick board and skidded. The horse snorted and threw its weight to one side. Earl reached for the saddle horn, but the animal moved again. Earl fell hard in the mud. Maggie ran to him. "Earl!" He tried to rise and winced. His right shoulder hung strange and low. He shook his head, jaw tight. "Don't touch it," he said through his teeth. Maggie dropped to one knee beside him. "Can you move your fingers?" He gave a small nod. "Yes. Arm's a dead piece of wood, though." Joe Medina, one of the hands, came running from the corral with a coil of rope in his arms. He was a quiet man, with quick eyes and a calm face, even when the weather went bad. "Need me to get Doc Reed?" he asked. "No time," Earl said. "Not with the river like that." Maggie looked from Earl to the dark water, and then to the cattle. The herd was growing restless. A calf bawled once, high and sharp. 3 cows pushed at the gate. Earl reached into the side pocket of his slicker with his good hand and pulled out a Red Bedroll. It was faded from use, but the color still burned bright against the gray morning. "Take this," he said. Maggie frowned. "Why?" "Tie it to your saddle horn," Earl said. "If you go in the water, we need to see you. Red shows up better than a dark horse in that mess." Joe looked toward the ford. "You plan to ride it?" "I plan to find out where it's safe," Maggie said. Earl studied her face for one long second. Then he gave a short nod. "You know the river better than anybody here now. Find the bottom. If there's a bar under that current, you'll feel it. Don't fight the water. Let it tell you where to go." Maggie took the bedroll and tied it tight to her saddle horn. The cloth flapped once in the wind like a bright flag. On the ridge, one of the riders lifted a hand. Even from far off, Maggie could hear the call carried by the wind. "Too much water for you, Holt." Joe spat into the mud. That's Ben Rusk's voice. Maggie swung onto her horse, a gray mare named Nell. "Then he can watch." She rode down toward the ford. Blackwater Fork was usually a calm crossing, shallow enough for a wagon if the weather had been dry. Not today. The water was full and fast. It tore around the rocks and jumped white over the low banks. On the far side, the ground rose in a long, muddy slope to the cattle trail. Maggie stopped at the edge and studied the current. She could see the foam lines twisting through the brown water. She could see a broken cottonwood branch caught in the middle, then whipped free. The river made a deep, ugly sound like something huge rolling stones in its mouth. Behind her, the cattle bawled again. She turned in the saddle. "Joe, bring the black cow and the lead steer to the gate. Keep the rest back until I call." "You want me to drive them after you?" Joe asked. "Not yet. First, I need to know where the bottom is." She kicked Nell forward. The mare stepped into the water and stopped at once. The cold hit up over her hooves, then her knees. Maggie leaned forward, low and steady. The current tugged at the horse's legs. Nell pinned her ears and snorted. Maggie kept the Red Bedroll tied to the saddle horn. It made a bright mark against the rain. She moved a little left, then a little right, watching the way the horse's steps changed. One spot was deep and soft. Another was firm. Then the mare's front hoof hit rock. Maggie leaned down and felt it too. A hard patch. A bar. She took a breath and rode a little farther. The horse slipped once, caught herself, and moved on. For 10 long yards, Maggie stayed in the saddle with water pushing against the mare's chest. The river tried to turn them. Then the ground under Nell's hooves became solid. Maggie looked up. She was on a narrow strip of gravel and stone, just under the surface and running across the ford in a slant. The water over it was shallower than she had feared. She turned Nell and looked back. The Red Bedroll stood out bright and clear in the rain. "Joe!" she shouted. "Bring them. This line's good." Joe did not waste a second. He and 2 other hands opened the gate and started the cattle forward. The black-lead steer came first, head low, ears twitching. 2 cows followed. Then the others pushed behind them, nervous and willing to bolt in any direction except the one Maggie needed. Maggie rode back to the bank and waved them in. Easy now. Easy. The lead steer stepped into the ford, stopped, and tossed his head. Water slapped his legs. Another cow tried to swing away. Maggie cut across her path with Nell, bringing the mare's shoulder close enough to block her. Joe came in from the side on a bay horse and pushed the back of the herd. The crossing began to move. At first it was only a few animals. Then it became a wave. The cattle crowded into the water, hooves churning mud, heads high, tails flicking. Their weight made the river change around them. Water burst against their sides. A calf slipped, righted itself, and ran on. Maggie shouted, Joe shouted, and the hands on the bank waved their arms to keep the herd lined up. Halfway across, a steer broke left toward the deeper channel. Maggie spurred Nell hard and cut him off. The mare lunged sideways, and muddy spray hit Maggie's coat. She grabbed the saddle horn and held on. Then, From the far side, a shout came from above the wind. "Help!" Maggie looked up. On a gravel bar downstream, a boy was standing in water up to his knees. He was thin and soaked, with one hand wrapped around a bent willow branch. His horse was gone. He wore a dark coat with the Rusk brand on the shoulder, and his face was white with fear. He shouted again, "Don't leave me!" Maggie's first thought was that Ben Rusk had sent him there to spy. Her second thought was that the boy looked about 14 and had no place else to go. Joe saw him too. "That's Rusk's boy," he said. "I know who he is," Maggie said. The boy slipped on the wet stones and almost went under. The willow branch bent low. He grabbed for it with both hands and cried out. Maggie made her choice in one breath. "Joe, keep the herd moving," she called. "Don't let them bunch up." She wheeled Nell around and rode back into the river. The current hit harder than before. The extra cattle had stirred the water, and the ford churned with mud and foam. The red bedroll on her saddle horn was the only clear, bright thing in all that gray. Nell fought the water, but Maggie kept her low and calm. She aimed for the gravel bar and did not look away. The horse's hooves found the hard patch she had marked before. In a few more seconds she was near the boy. "Get on!" Maggie shouted. The boy stared at her like he had not heard right. "I said get on." He let go of the willow, stumbled once, and reached for her hand. Maggie grabbed his wrist and pulled him behind her on the saddle. He was light, but scared people can still be hard to lift when they are shaking. He got one leg over the horse and clung to her coat. "Hold on tight," she said. The boy did not answer. He only wrapped both arms around her waist and ducked his head. Nell turned and started back. The river shoved at them sideways. Water broke over the mare's knees and splashed Maggie's boots. The red bedroll flapped and snapped in the wind. For one breath, Maggie thought the horse would slip. For one breath, the whole world seemed to lean. Then Nell found the gravel bar again. Maggie drove her heels in and got the horse up onto the north bank. The boy slid down at once and nearly fell, but Maggie caught his coat and held him upright. He looked at her with wide eyes. "You came back for me." "You were right there," she said. "Where else would I go?" He stared at the river, then at the cattle, then at her. Rain ran off his nose and chin. "I'm Danny Rusk," he said at last. Maggie gave a short nod. "I'm Maggie Holt." Danny swallowed. "I told my dad that Ford was no good. He said the water looked fine from the ridge." Maggie almost laughed, but the herd was still moving, and there was no room for it yet. "Well, your dad was wrong." Danny nodded hard, like that answered more than one thing. Back in the Ford, Joe was keeping the cattle lined up. 2 cows had drifted toward the deeper water, but he and the other hands had them under control. The black-lead steer was already on the far side, shaking mud from his coat. The rest of the herd followed, one after another, hooves slipping, then catching on stone. Ben Rusk rode down to the bank from the ridge a few minutes later. His hat was pulled low against the rain. He saw Danny standing safe beside Maggie and pulled his horse to a stop. "You got him out," he said. Maggie looked at him and said nothing. Ben's eyes moved to the herd crossing behind her. He saw the red bedroll tied to her saddle horn. He saw the line of cattle. He saw the safe path she had found. For the first time that morning, he did not look sure of himself. "That Ford's yours today," he said. Danny stepped forward before Maggie could answer. "Dad, she came back for me. I was stuck on that bar." Ben looked at his son for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slow and tight. "I see that." He turned his horse and rode back up the ridge without another word. Maggie watched him go, then turned back to the river. The cattle were still crossing, but the worst of it was over. The led steer had reached the south bank. The herd was following the line she had marked with the Red Bedroll. The rain still fell, but the water had stopped rising so fast. Joe came up beside her, wet to the skin and smiling in spite of himself. "You did it," he said. Maggie looked at the cattle, the muddy river, the boy standing shivering beside her horse, and the red cloth bright against the gray storm. "Not yet," she said. But an hour later, when the last cow climbed out of the ford and the herd started up the home trail, she knew it was true. By late afternoon, the rain had eased to a mist. The sky broke open in thin strips of light. The cattle were safe in the lower pasture south of the river, where the grass was high and the ground was dry enough to hold them. Earl Baines had his arm in a sling and a pale look on his face, but he was standing. He watched Maggie tie the Red Bedroll back behind her saddle and said, "You found the bottom and kept your head." Maggie shrugged. The horse did most of the work. Earl gave a tired smile. "No, the horse did what you told her. That's the part that matters. And—" Danny Rusk stood nearby, wrapped in a spare coat and holding a cup of coffee with both hands. He had stopped shaking. He still looked young, but the fear was gone from his face. "You can stay till morning," Maggie told him. "Then we'll send you home dry as we can." Danny nodded. "Thanks." He glanced at the herd, then at the river behind them. "My dad won't say it out loud, but he saw the crossing." "He knows." Maggie gave a small nod. That was enough for now. The sun dropped low over the hills and turned the wet ground gold. The Red Bedroll hung from the saddle like a bright piece of fire in the evening light. Maggie stood by Nell and watched the cattle settle down at last. Tails still, heads down, safe on the right side of Blackwater Ford. The day had started with a flooded river and a herd on the edge of being lost. It ended with dry ground, full pens, and one boy who made it home because someone chose to turn back. Maggie did not call it luck. She only scratched Nell under the jaw, looked once more at the dark water, and started walking the horse toward the barn.